The chandeliers in the Harrington ballroom did not merely throw light. They dripped it, drop by drop, like melted gold falling through centuries of entitlement. Every crystal teardrop was a history lesson that the room refused to learn. Waiters moved, like carefully orchestrated shadows, invisible until a glass was empty. A string quartet tried to sweeten the air with something elegant, but the music could not drown out the language of glances that sorted human beings into categories with the ease of habit. It was a night built for the camera lens. Emerald gowns orchestrated next to navy suits, antique candelabras reflecting a family crest that had survived the economy's winters without losing a leaf. Yet, beneath the polished marble and curated smiles, the old scaffolding creaked. Money arranging dignity like furniture, skin grading, ranking, whispering. Victoria Harrington entered the room as if the floor had been instructed to rise under her step. Crimson silk clung to her like an argument won, diamonds thrown across her throat like stars that had learned to obey. She knew how to glance without appearing to look, how to touch a forearm without actually touching a person, how to signal a server without seeing his face. Power, to her, was a choreography perfected in private mirrors. She was a specialist in placement, who was seated where, who could be seen next to whom, which smile would be remembered in what magazine. She had never lifted anything heavier than a rumor, never met a boundary that persisted past her insistence. She had been warned, gently, repeatedly, by her older brother that tonight mattered more than the nightly theater of prestige. But warnings and consequences have never been close friends for people who believe the world is one long runway built in their honor. He stood near the edge of the room, observing, not hiding, carrying a tray not because he had been asked to, but because a server had nearly tripped navigating a knot of donors glued together by wealth. Marcus Hale wore a charcoal suit that misunderstood nothing and announced nobody. The tray was a courtesy, a small act of decency to rescue a stranger from embarrassment. He intended to set it down after a few steps. He did not get the chance. Victoria turned. The glass nearest his hand became the glass she wanted, and then, swift as a bored cat, her wrist flicked. Red wine arced through the air, found his crisp shirt like a bullseye, and crashed downward in a cascade that looked for a second like the world telling the truth. Something rich poured onto something white, until it stained and stayed. The quartet's melody froze. 100 pupils widened. 1,000 unspoken rules vibrated in the space between one breath and the next. And then, before anyone could move, the Baroque laugh. Victoria's practiced trill, bright and merciless, slicing the quiet clean in two. "Darling," she sang, bored and amused, "watch where you're serving. It would be such a shame to ruin the evening for the real guests." He did not flinch. He placed the tray on a nearby table as if the table had been waiting for the privilege. Wine threaded down his collar into cloth that did not deserve this story, and still he did not touch it. His eyes rose and found hers. They did not harden. They deepened. It is a particular kind of sorrow that faces insult without giving it oxygen, older than etiquette, older than law, the kind of sorrow that carries entire neighborhoods of memory in silence. He held the room upright by refusing to fall. Everyone felt it and pretended not to. "But what happens next will change everything." Edward Harrington heard the laugh and knew something had tilted. He was a man who understood tilt. He had spent 4 decades forcing markets to lean in his direction, bending supply chains like wire, and convincing investors that yesterday's rust could be alloyed into tomorrow's shine. Harrington Global had outgrown its beginnings, a steel mill with a respectable stink, soot-blackened hands that bought wedding rings and Christmas turkeys. He had remade all of it, replaced furnaces with robotics, bellowing foremen with dashboards, and strikes with stock options. In every photograph, he looked like The answer to a question people had stopped asking. Silver hair arranged, tie practicing humility, a gaze that said, "I have thought about this longer than you have been alive." Yet the Empire's bones were aging, and he knew it. The future runs on. Lighter, greener, smarter. His lawyers had cut the path. His bankers had warmed the room. The engineers had nodded carefully in their presentations. Tonight was supposed to be the close. The company he needed stood precisely where he had asked it to be, on the edge, listening, measuring him by a rubric that did not include his name. He had watched Marcus Hale for months, studied his patents like scripture. Hale Innovations was not a miracle, but a system of miracles. Tiny efficiencies braided, modest advances stacked, a fresh vocabulary for energy spoken without arrogance. In language, the market adores. Scalable. In language, the earth deserves. Survivable. Edward had shaken Marcus' hand twice. He had liked the way the younger man withheld agreement without withholding respect. He had liked, if he were honest, how the mirror of Marcus's eyes had made him ask himself questions he had stopped asking. He did not see the spill. He heard the reaction, that thin, sharp quiet, the soundless alarm of a room learning it has been watched sinning. He turned, saw his sister's red dress and the redder stain, and felt a cold that was not the room's. He moved. He arrived with apologies he had rehearsed in boardrooms for margins and misstatements and awkward layoff seasons. He tried to apply them to human injury. "Marcus," he began, but Marcus did not open that door for him. "No apologies from you," Marcus said, his voice low enough that the room had to lean toward it. "Not yet." He looked at Victoria. He did not look at her dress, or her diamonds, or the dance of regret beginning in her throat. He looked at her the way a teacher looks at a child who has never been told that other people are not props. She tried a smile that had unpacked 100 conflicts in her favor. "It was an accident. Accidents are what happens when gravity remembers us," he said gently. "This was a decision, but I forgive decisions more easily than I forgive assumptions." Color rose under her cosmetics. Confusion kicked at her poise. She searched for an exit and found none. The room wanted a cue, a path back to music and mergers. It did not get one. Marcus turned so the room could hear him without straining. "My name," he said, eyes returning to Victoria and then to Edward, "is Marcus Hale. I do not serve this party. I serve communities who want a world to hand to their children without apology. I am the CEO of Hale Innovations. And this is the last glass of wine that will be spilled in my name by your house." Air left the room through invisible cracks. Edward forgot the choreography of reassurance. The general counsel, across the floor, became a statue. The CFO forgot which pocket held the phone. The head of PR wrote 5 statements in her mind and set fire to each as it formed. Investors, expensive collars, suddenly too tight, calculated whether public outrage would be hot enough to melt Endace. Victoria's laugh turned traitor and fled. Someone's conscience, unemployed for years, applied for a temporary job. And in the red quiet, the beginning of consequence, stood up and asked to be counted. He did not leave immediately. Mercy people mistake for pride kept him there. He did not grandstand. He told a story. It was not a press release. It was a ledger. "Your father's mill," he began, and the word father moved through Edward like a bell tolling under ice, "was the reason my parents took a second mortgage on their dreams. They worked nights. You counted in scars, not hours. They believed loyalty was a contract. The day the West Wall gave way, the lawyers called it an unforeseeable event and sent flowers. They did not send a check. They did not send a name to attach to the pain. They sent silence. I was 14 and learned quickly that silence was more expensive than funerals. He spoke of placements for orphans that look like charity and feel like storage. He spoke of lights kept on by waiting tables while waiting for a scholarship. He spoke of laboratories where his ideas were smiled at like puppies, until a whiter, louder voice repeated the same and got the grant. He spoke of patents filed at kitchen tables and partnerships negotiated across coffees he could barely afford. Negotiations where the first term offered was always smaller than the one printed for others. He spoke without heat, allowing the facts their own fire. He moved from sorrow to structure with a craft that made heads bow without being told to. I chose, when it stopped being a choice, to spend what I had gathering the people your machines forgot, he said, gesturing not at the chandeliers but the staff, the drivers, the attendants standing at the edge of glamour. I built a company that listens before it innovates. We found profit where others claimed there was only conscience. We did not name our product after our parents because our parents had no use for our logos. We named our prices after the families they could keep warm. Let the room return to its breath. Then he added the sentence that changes empires. And we will not sell the future to those who still believe that dignity is optional. Edward tried one last door. We can fix this, he said, and his voice sounded not like a titan but like a brother who had believed in his power too long. Victoria will apologize. The board will apologize. I will apologize. We will do what? Marcus asked softly. Stitch an apology to an insult and call it a suit that fits. He did not wield humiliation. He did not need it. Understanding without repair is complicity. Apology without accountability is theater. Theater does not heat homes. He thanked the staff by name. Names he had learned in the first hour because he had been raised by people for whom names were the only currency that mattered, and walked toward the door. It did not open into a red-carpeted hallway. It opened into a wind that had been waiting for years to be invited inside. And then the story widened. The morning after a humiliation, an empire checks its mirrors for angles. The spin was written in an hour. Misunderstanding, unfortunate, does not reflect our values. A photo existed of Victoria looking stricken, a tissue in her hand like redemption's handkerchief. The PR firm tried to make it weep for her. But the market has a nose for rot when it threatens returns. 3 suppliers asked whether Hale would take their calls. 2 large funds, both led by managers who had been waiting for a reason to divest from metal that no longer glowed, asked their analysts to describe climate-adjacent plays, not led by men who think diversity is a sponsorship level. Overnight, boilerplate became a liability. Mission statements are a terrible place to hide when people begin asking about payroll. Edward cancelled the day's meetings and drove not to the office but to the west lot. He had not walked that lot since the day the wall fell. He had paid for the memorial, a modest slab with too few names carved into it, but he had not read it since the carving. He stood before the stone and was astonished by how tired grief can look when it has not been exercised. The names were citizens of his memory's foreign country. He wanted to apologize to them like a man wants to drink the ocean to extinguish a flame. He put his hand on the granite and found behind his lids, his father's hands pulling a shift change into a home that smelled of the mill and meatloaf, and a mother who had made both bearable. He found the boy he had been, hungry for something beyond the soot, making a vow that ambition would protect what loyalty had not. He found how easily a vow mutates when fed by success. He whispered, I did not mean to forget you, and knew. That intent is the laziest of alibis. The board demanded emergency counsel. The general counsel recommended an apology with teeth, not an offering bowl, a plan. The CFO named numbers out loud like curses. The head of PR argued against the word racism because escalatory language damages brand goodwill, and the head of HR The one person in the room who worked in a building with fewer windows replied with a tired bravery, "Evasion is why we will deserve what comes next." Edward listened, without hearing until he heard. He said, "Stop." And the room obeyed, not because he was their chairman, but because the tone of his voice suggested gravity had a personal request. "We will not rush to secure the appearance of our remorse," he said. "We will rush to secure the safety of the people we have injured and neglected. If a deal is lost, let it be lost because we have finally found our conscience. If a shareholder flees, let them. If a headline mocks us, let it. We will not perform. We will repair." Victoria did not attend. She had decamped to the family compound with a publicist who wanted to script contrition. She did not know how to be quiet, where cameras could not see her. Silence had always felt to her like a failure to crown the moment. She called Edward 3 times. He did not answer the first 2. On the third, he asked, "Why?" And she said honestly and terribly, "Because he had a tray." There are answers that do not deserve replies. He hung up, not because he was righteous, but because he was exhausted by the version of love that always asks to be spared from reality. Marcus, meanwhile, went home to a one-bedroom apartment with a view not of a skyline, but of a community garden he funded without telling reporters. He stripped off the ruined shirt and did not put it in the trash. He washed it, hung it beside the window, and let the stain dry into a shape he would not name. He sat at the table where his company had first existed as sketches, the kind drawn by an engineer who has learned that a straight line rarely honors the terrain it crosses. His phone did not stop vibrating. Investors who had avoided him when his hair was still close-cropped and his suits were not bespoke discovered affection. A congressman's office wanted to ensure they would be allied with his work in sustainability. A magazine pitched a profile with photographs of him strolling through his childhood neighborhood as if he were a tourist in his own past. He turned the phone face down. He dialed 3 numbers not on any reporter's list. His aunt who had rescued the boy he had been from the worst house he had been placed in, his mentor in college who had opened a lab and a library when the bursar closed a door, his plant manager, who had once worked 2 floors down from the west wall that fell, and lived to limp-speak the story. He said, "I will not let them turn this into a sermon about one bad apple. We are building something that replaces the barrel." Met with his leadership team in a room that still smelled of paint and hope. "The deal is not a prize and we are not contestants," he said. "We partner with those who prove they can be trusted. The proof will not be a check. It will be a confession. And a contract that pays the bill." Conscience ran up. He laid out the conditions that would replace the old term sheet, if there was to be any path forward. An independent safety audit of Harrington's plants, a fund endowed not for 5 years, but forever for workers harmed by the company's historic negligence, board seats for community representatives who lived within a mile of every Harrington facility, and a commitment indexed to profits that would install his company's technology in the neighborhoods that paid in health for yesterday's success. His team did not flinch. Many of them had chosen him because he refused to close deals that required him to forget his beginnings. They had learned the arithmetic of dignity. It accounted for externalities not as footnotes, but as the principle. Numbers could be friends with conscience if you introduced them properly. They planned. And something began in Edward that even he, a professional persuader, could not have predicted. Looked from outside like contrition, inside it felt like archaeology. He called the families who had been told decades ago that their husbands and wives and fathers and mothers had died because sometimes walls fall. The phone numbers had changed. The houses had changed. The city had changed its clothes. But one woman lived in the same address her husband had left for a night shift from which he never returned. He went to her door without a camera. She opened it slowly, and then, entirely. Her hair was white, like a flag that refuses to surrender. "I remember your father," she said before he could speak, and that sentence pierced him more than any condemnation. He tried to apologize, and she let him try, then stopped him with a hand the world had taught to stop traffic. "Do not bring me flowers," she said. "Bring me proof. Bring me my neighbors' names carved into your lobby, so you will have to read them to yourself before you decide who deserves safety next." He nodded, and, for the first time since he had been a boy standing ankle-deep in mill dust, he felt he knew what to do without calling a consultant. He called the board to a warehouse, not a boardroom. Workers were invited to speak without their supervisors. An independent auditor, not on Harrington's retainer, explained the difference between standards the company met and standards that protected human beings. A nurse from a clinic near the West Lot described the cough that had become a birthright in it. Certain zip codes. A historian spoke of how companies like Harrington had learned to translate accountability into philanthropy, so their ledgers would look like generosity instead of penance. Edward listened and did not defend. He put two motions to a vote to endow a perpetual fund for victims of past negligence and to re-engineer every plant beginning with the most dangerous, adopting standards that might be called excessive by those for whom the right number is the one that protects margins. The board passed the fund. The board hesitated at the standards. Board members hate words like excessive, especially when they wear their fiduciary duty like armor. He said, "My fiduciary duty is to ensure this company is safe for the people who make it possible. Profit is an outcome, not a god." They voted. It passed by 2 votes. He exhaled like a man walking out of court having been acquitted of the wrong crime. When Edward met Marcus in a small room with an ugly carpet, they did not shake hands first. They looked at each other the way 2 men look who know that a bridge, to be walked across, must be built from both sides. Edward began this time with, "I am sorry," and ended with, "I am not asking for forgiveness, only a chance to repair what we broke." Marcus listened, and then asked the single question that matters after damage. "Who will you be when the headlines get bored?" Edward said, "The man I should have been when no one was watching." They wrote a new document. It had numbers, but the numbers served a story. It named the fund. It named the board seats. It named the audit schedule in years instead of calendar quarters. It named neighborhoods. It named air and water and power, not as commodities, but as promises. And it named Victoria, not in print, not for cameras, but in a clause that required members of the executive family to complete a year of service not to clients, but to communities, with supervision by people who owed them nothing. Victoria arrived for her year of service like a woman who had been sentenced to humility. She believed, in the secret room where old habits hide, that a few tears and a letter written on expensive stationery would have sufficed. Instead, she was assigned to a clinic that had learned to practice medicine without asking the city permission to care for the people the city forgot. Her supervisor was a black woman with an economy of speech that wealth cannot buy. Victoria learned to stack boxes and fold sheets and call patients by their names without adding "sweetie." She learned that apology is a dress you wear only if you are prepared to work in it. She hated it. She kept hating it until the hating began to feel like a luxury she could no longer afford. One afternoon, she refilled the printer paper in the clinic's waiting room. A child stared at her necklace like it was a language. A man with a cough asked where the bathroom was without a trace of intimidation. An old woman complained about the chairs. No one asked her for a photograph. No one asked the last name that once opened doors like a key carved by a king. She began, in the absence of deference to notice, the dignity of people who refuse to be small, the economies of care built by people. With no budgets, the way grief can live in a room without killing everything in it. On a Wednesday that had no right to be special, she folded a blanket around a woman shivering not from cold, but from fear. The woman said, "Thank you," and Victoria said, "You're welcome," and the exchange rearranged something heavy in her chest. She wrote, for the first time, not a press release, but a letter to a girl she had been years ago, the one who had learned to confuse visibility with value. She told that girl, gently, to step aside. The old deal did not resurrect. The new one took its place, not like a prize but like a charter. Lawyers tried to sand its edges. They discovered that both men had brought chisels. The markets predicted disaster. The first quarter under the new agreement looked like the markets had been right. Shares slid. Pundits said the word naive, as if they had been assigned to say it. But communities, where the company had once been a rumor, began to name streets after results. That could not be spun. Fewer ambulance sirens at shift change, fewer inhalers refilled on Fridays, fewer funerals on Saturdays. The market, which admires what people admire, turned its head. Money does not love anyone, but sometimes it learns to flirt with decency. Marcus kept the stained shirt. He framed it, but not for a lobby. He hung it in a hallway between his kitchen and the door he used most. On mornings when he forgot to be careful with his anger, and on nights when he was tempted to permit his weariness to count as wisdom, he touched the stain and remembered two things at once: how easy it is to confuse humiliation with heroism, and how necessary it is to keep choosing kindness, even when kindness is the least efficient path to a result. He visited the West Lot Memorial when the company carved the additional names, and did not bring a camera. He met with line workers who had outlived more promises than he had made. He funded a stipend that allowed them to attend their children's school conferences without losing pay. He walked the line between forgiveness and accountability like a tightrope that refused to be anything else. He failed on Mondays and tried again on Tuesdays. Edward, who had never been a religious man, learned a prayer that did not require a god. I will be who I promise to be when it costs me something to remain that man. He hired Joy. He gave up control of foundations that had once served his reputation more than the people they were designed to help. He disinvited himself from panels where men in blue ties performed sorrow. He cancelled a gala. He brought coffee to a 6 a.m. retrofit and held a flashlight while a young engineer, whose grandmother had been fired for organizing a union in that same plant, measured the space between two bolts and declared, smiling, that the old world was finally making room for the new. He wrote to the woman whose door he had knocked on and asked whether she would come to the plant and bless the wall before anyone worked under it again. She came. She did not bless the wall. She read the names carved into the lobby and then placed her palms against the safety railing and said, "I bless whoever holds this and chooses caution over speed." The workers cheered like salvation had finally chosen utility over theater. Victoria finished her year of service without a photographer. Her final report to the board was not decorative. It line items that required money and line routines that required humility. She recommended tying executive bonuses not to stock price but to safety metrics and community satisfaction surveys. She recommended creating an anonymous mechanism for the staff to report executives who wanted to hurry past steps, designed to make it harder to hurt people. The board scoffed. Edward voted yes. The board was astonished. The policy passed. Because a board knows how to count, and because investors who live long enough learn that scandal is more expensive than restraint. There remained those who wanted Marcus to make this into a simple story. He refused. He said, "Racism," out loud without apology, and refused to pretend that a fund with a pleasant name erased what had been done to countless unnamed people. He also refused to permit a single woman's reckless cruelty to become the mask worn by complex histories. He taught a class once a month at a community college near where his parents had grown old too early and died too soon. He did not tell the students about the chandelier night unless a student asked. When asked, he told it plainly. A humiliation is not a strategy. A principled refusal is not revenge. A repair is not a gift. He married later a woman who read contracts for a living and novels for joy. They had no children but sponsored the children of people who wanted to work and could not because their air and water had been rationed without their consent. He remained wrong about many things, but not about the one that matters. That dignity cannot be granted by people who possess power. It can only be recognized. And recognized dignity is the most relentless engineer. It rewrites blueprints. It removes steps. It installs ramps. It changes the measurements used by those who thought the only measure that mattered was growth. The ballroom opened its doors again, months after the night the room had learned it was mortal. The chandeliers shone with a humility no chandelier has ever learned on its own. The quartet rehearsed, and this time asked to play music written by a woman whose name had been kept out of halls like this by men who congratulated themselves on their taste. The staff had name tags with salaries attached that a union had made possible. The servers did not move like shadows. They moved like people whose work made the room possible. A placard near the bar read, "This event funded childcare, transit passes, and tuition for every hourly worker scheduled tonight." Apology does not build a new world. Policy does. And somewhere far from that room, in a kitchen, where the light was not a performance, but a benevolence, two men met over tea, like old adversaries who had become uneasy allies. "I am still angry," Marcus said. "Good," Edward replied. "So am I, and I plan to make that useful." They toasted with mugs bought at a corner store, whose owner had been invited to sell his goods in a lobby that had once displayed only photographs of men with scissors cutting ribbon. The tea tasted like something that used to be bitter and had learned how to be strong without burning the tongue. What does any of this teach the person listening who believes they would have behaved better under chandeliers? That cruelty often borrows the voice of voice, joking and waits until the room is too polite to protest. That the myth of the self-made man is a costume stitched from other people's invisibility. That apology is currency that inflates when printed too often without backing. That capital can behave like a citizen if citizens teach it how. That redemption is not a door swung wide for the guilty to dash through. It is a door heavy enough to require two hands, one from the harmed, one from the learning, to open. Never judge anyone by appearance. Pain has no color or class, ambition has no single accent, and dignity is not a garnish added at the end of a deal. We are all standing in rooms built by people we rarely see. We are all drinking under chandeliers wired by hands that have been paid too little for too long. When you laugh, ask what your laughter protects. When you apologize, ask what your apology repairs. When you sign your name, ask which names have never been invited to the line below yours, and why. If this story touched your heart, let it do more than warm you for an evening. Let it reroute you in the morning. Share it with someone who calls injustice an accident. Share it with someone who signs checks and someone who signs for packages and someone who has learned to duck inside themselves when a laugh grows too sharp. Like and subscribe not because the algorithm deserves your devotion, but because stories like this carry instructions for rooms you may never enter and names you should learn to say with care. Carry the lesson forward. Repair is not a press conference. It is a practice you repeat until the room remembers how to be worthy of the people inside it. Because every story hides